All right, welcome and good afternoon, everyone. WithSecure is proud to present our top 5 challenges in achieving and maintaining compliance to the DFS's 500 Cybersecurity Second Amendment. Pardon me. All right, so quick agenda for today's presentation. We're going to go over some introductions of the team, give you some background of the amendment, and then go over the top 5 challenges that we've identified, and then some time for Q&A. So, for the team, we have John Gerald, a security and risk management consultant here at WithSecure. So John has over 10 years of experience in cybersecurity, including program development, risk management, and supporting financial institutions with regulatory compliance and exams. For WithSecure's clients, he delivers secure design reviews, threat modeling, cyber maturity assessments, cloud configuration reviews, web application pen testing, and other services. Richard Souls is also on the line. So Richard's been consulting in cybersecurity for decades, is a court-admitted expert witness, and holds multiple certifications. In addition to delivering risk management work, he also performs threat modeling, tabletops, pen testing, and ethical vulnerability research. Last year, Richard was published in U.S. News and World Report, VMware blog, HelpNet Security, and has also participated in public speaking at cons and other hacker gatherings. My name is Miguel Gutierrez, and I'll be your moderator for today. I have over 5 years of experience in cybersecurity, um, including security systems architecture for financial institutions, design review, and regulatory compliance. As a quick reminder throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, please submit them using the questions tab. We'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to some background of the amendment. So, WithSecure has been keeping tabs on this amendment since DFS first proposed it in September of 2022, and now it's been officially adopted as of last month, November 2023. We've identified about a little over half of these sections have been amended or are new, and most of these do present a sort of significant uplift and challenge to organizations. One thing that we've found through our experience working with financial institutions is that we expect many of you, including you in the audience, to already have these controls in place. However, the challenge comes with having that extra scrutiny from a regulator and anticipating questions and processes of providing evidence or otherwise testing these controls, right? Where gaps or weaknesses might be discovered, and that's something you want to be prepared for ahead of time. As some extra background, DFS also does issue enforcement actions, and these are a matter of public record. WithSecure conducted an analysis of these and found since 2017, since this regulation has been out, about 11 enforcement actions have been issued with regards to cybersecurity regulations, which is about 25% of all enforcement actions issued by DFS. So that's a significant portion related to cybersecurity. And the average penalty here is $3 million, so it can be pretty expensive to not be compliant. Moving on to these top 5 challenges, we have identified are timely vulnerability remediation, BCDR plans and testing, privileged access management, asset inventory, and multi-factor authentication. You can see from the timeline here that the implementation deadlines for these start in a little less than a year from now. Okay, let's move on to the first of these top 5 challenges, timely vulnerability remediation. And I'll hand this off to John to go over the challenges.
Thank you, Miguel. So I think anyone who's tried to manage vulnerability remediation will recognize that the top challenge is just going to be the volume of vulnerabilities that are discovered. The scanning tools can identify tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, and each of those are going to require effort. There's coordination that needs to go into this, engaging stakeholders across the organization to perform that remediation, and it can be complex, especially since you're dealing not with just Windows and Unix, but all sorts of heterogeneous environments. So obviously, the balancing the volume and the effort and the complexity and its timeliness is going to be difficult. Some of the other, I won't go through this whole list because there's a lot of challenges around vulnerability management, but some of the others is just the um, potentially managing feeds from multiple tools. So you may not just have Qualys and Nessus or those type of scanners. There could be other vulnerability tools that are that you're using to discover. Um, the uh, the um, reporting can be a challenge as well. So integrating the results, calculating things like aging of vulnerabilities, aligning vulnerabilities to the owners and those who are accountable to remediate can be difficult just from a data handling exercise. And then another to call out is there's a new requirement also included in the amendment to do manual reviews for legacy systems that can't be automatically scanned. So obviously that can be difficult to come up with your methodologies for manually discovering vulnerabilities on out of support systems. One of the things that we're going to do for each of these topics is talk about some potential questions that the regulators might ask when doing an exam. So I'll hand it over to Miguel, and he will take us through some possible questions.
Yep, and hopefully these questions will help prompt some of your own that you can include in the Q&A once we're done with the presentation as well. So if I'm a regulator and I come in, I'm going to have already obtained your asset inventory, right? As another part of the regulation. I'm going to ask you, when was the last time you scanned all of these assets? Can you provide me reporting showing vulnerability remediation performance against the SLAs you defined over the past 12 months? Can you give me evidence that any missed SLAs were escalated and addressed? You know, are these missed SLAs a systemic issue? What's your go to green plan? How are you going to identify, obtain, test, install, and verify new patches across all operating systems, network devices, and software? How do you ensure that your applications are using the latest versions of third-party libraries and other software components? I might ask, can you provide me a change management ticket from the last 6 months and evidence that shows that these selected samples of assets were rescanned after the change? How do you how do you test these patches for compatibility and integrity? Can you give me evidence that this was tested and performed for, any sample that I ask for? Are all of these procedures written down and ready to be handed to a regulator? What's your policy and procedure for the exceptions to this? Can you provide a list and rationale for these exceptions? There's a lot of evidence I'm going to be asking for, and I think Richard has some recommendations for how to best address these.
Thanks, Miguel. And you can tell he's asked these questions before. Uh, these recommendations are kind of coming from a high to a low level. Obviously, at the top, you want to talk about centralized governance and SLA management, risk-based SLAs, and prioritization. And as you go further down, you're looking at things like automation when possible, though we obviously know that it's not entirely possible in any given organization. Proactive patching, maintenance windows are obviously very important as well, and accountability, which should be spelled out kind of at that top level with the centralized governance and SLA management. And lastly, I just kind of want to highlight emergency patching processes because we've seen several zero-day vulnerabilities released this year that affected a lot of large financial institutions. One that comes to mind for me the most is the Citrix vulnerabilities that were chained together. Um, but also we saw several Windows, Microsoft Windows-based 0 days that came out this year. And so emergency patching processes are very important for organizations to keep in mind, as well as the rest of the things that I've mentioned.
Thanks for that, Richard. Now let's quickly move on to our next challenge here. And we've got BCDR plan development, maintenance, and testing. And I'll hand this back off to John to go over the challenges here.
Thanks, Miguel. So I think one of the main challenges around this is the concept of cyber resilience. So for traditional DR plans, the scenario is that a meteorite hits the data center, it's a smoking hole in the ground, and how do you recover? How do you bring up your recovery environment? In the context of cybersecurity, there's some other factors that need to be taken into consideration. So things like, obviously ransomware could change the equation here. DDoS attacks or an attack by a malicious insider who's looking to, specifically disrupt your recovery process. These plans, cyber resilience DR plan, will need to take those factors into account. They'll need to obviously look at secure backups, making sure that the backups, can't be tampered or destroyed as part of the attack. The plan will need to include things like containment and eradication strategies, and again, not part of a typical DR plan, but in the context of cybersecurity and cyber resilience, then a regulator would expect to see those type of elements in the plan. And it also might include some sort of concept of adaptive planning. So analyzing the circumstances of the cyber event and then adjusting your plan potentially on the fly accordingly, depending on what's occurred. Some of the other challenges I won't go through in detail is just the governance and coordination. So, anyone who's tried to manage these BCDR at scale knows, getting all the information around centralizing your DR plans, making sure that those plans are up to date, accurate, detailed, and so on. Keeping track of scheduling testing, capturing the results of testing, tracking the issues coming out of that. All of that is a significant challenge as well. Miguel, you want to ask some questions?
Of course. So if I'm a regulator and I'm coming in, I'm going to, I don't know, from a broad level, ask you, how is your incident response and BCDR? How are those two functions integrated within your organization? Even before we get to the DR plan, we have that business impact analysis, which is crucial for that. How does that identify documents, data, facilities, any other assets, personnel, competencies essential to continued business operations? I ask for your DR plan, and hopefully it exists and it's a good one, but I also want to know that it's a document actively being used in the organization, right? Does it include a date of last review and update? Is there a process for continual, annual review of this? Um, Explain to me, how does this plan address cyber resiliency? Show me the last DR test date for all of your high-risk applications in your asset inventory. Again, referencing that asset inventory. I can ask you for a randomly sampled application. What are the latest DR test results for that? Um, you can't just pass on that kind of question. I need evidence that that app actually participated. Did that test meet the RTO and RPO? Your last DR exercise, what were the list of issues that came up during that test? Um, I need evidence of that tracking, reporting, timely remediation of issues identified in that testing. Um, I might just pick a randomly selected issue and ask you, how did the remediation of that go? Maybe a common question is, how does your personnel access these plans if they can't access a corporate network? There's a lot that goes around this, a lot that you have to prove a regulator, and you have to be prepared for all of it. Richard, I think you might have some suggestions.
Yeah, thank you, Miguel. So, as someone who's passionate about incident response, has led IR teams, and also does a lot of readiness work, I have some opinions on this. Again, we're talking from these recommendations at a high level down to a low level, and you're looking at things like establishing a centralized oversight governance of the process and the program. So, establishing who's responsible for it, who's leading it, who's involved in it. You're talking about prioritizing based on your business impact analysis and your asset risk classifications. You're going to provide application owners with a modular DR plan, template, or templates, and guidance on ensuring cyber resilience is addressed in their plans. So it's not all on your head, it's not all on your heads or your shoulders. You have to use the resources obviously available to you in terms of your division heads or people, application owners. You're going to conduct audits, peer reviews to ensure DR plans meet standards, and you're going to develop incident response playbooks for disruptive cyber events, ransomware, denial of service, insider threats, nation state actors, any kind of incidents that could be coming up. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these things as we progress through other slides. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that incidents will happen. If an incident has not happened to you yet, you're incredibly lucky or you're not aware of it. And so being prepared for this at this level is extremely important through mandate and also through the desire to stem any kind of flow of damage. Thanks, Miguel.
Yep. Thank you, Richard. Let's move on over to privileged access management here. And I'll give this back over to John to go over the challenges.
Thanks, Miguel. Again, I think most of those on the audience are familiar with the challenges of managing privileged access. I think probably one of the top challenges is just around identifying, discovering your privileged access and categorizing it. This can be a major undertaking of maintaining that inventory of privileged accounts. Another challenge is the amendment specifically requires that Class A companies implement a privileged access management solution. There was some, pushback during the comment period around that requirement being too prescriptive and basically, dictating or mandating that financial institutions install and operate a vendor product or a tool. And while those will certainly help with the process of managing privileged access, they can be complicated to operate, onboarding all of your systems, ensuring that your systems have been onboarded to those to that tool can be a challenge. There's a number of different, additional challenges, heterogeneous environments, managing privileged access for legacy systems, Unix in particular. Unix can also be a challenge just given that it's not centrally managed. It's like Windows, so you run into challenges with things like, SSH keys and managing sudo users. All of that in the Unix space can get complicated. So yeah, not an easy thing to tackle. Miguel, you want to put on your regulator hat and ask some questions?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the easiest question, which might not be so easy, and that's give me an inventory of all of your privileged accounts. We've got to know where they all are, right? That might be harder, easier said than done. How are these privileged credentials managed and protected? Can you give me evidence that these are being rotated according to policy? Do you have any exceptions and rationale for any credentials that are outside of this rotation policy, right? How are you going to monitor the use of these accounts? Have visibility into each of these accounts. How are you going to detect anomalous or otherwise unauthorized privileged account activity? How do you measure a baseline for what's normal privileged account activity? Can you show me your incident response playbook, right? Do you have a playbook for privileged account compromise? Your users that have privileged access, do they have to undergo special training? Any additional training? With great power comes great responsibility. Can you give me a list of manual tasks that users have to use privileged credentials for? Can you explain to me why these aren't automated? Um, give me another second. I mean, do you have any kind of automation to detect these privileged accounts? There's again a lot that can be asked here and a lot that you have to be prepared for. And I think Richard has a few suggestions.
Thanks, Miguel. Of course. And so again, keeping in theme, we're talking from high level to low level here. So obviously there's a theme here in terms of inventorying, and this privileged access management is no different. You want to clearly define and tag your privileged access. You want to maintain a central inventory of privileged accounts. Further, you're looking to develop a privileged access discovery process, train privileged users on the risk policies and procedures. Um, and as we know, security is not just a one and done deal or a flat line. So you're going to have to recertify privileged access frequently. In other words, add this to a regularly scheduled maintenance procedure. Obviously, as you've seen with other slides, we want to try and automate privileged tasks as much as possible and remove standing privileged access. This is a good time to talk about cloud. Anyone familiar with AWS, for example, though, of course, any of the major cloud providers have these things, is probably familiar with roles and the difference between roles and IAM users. With a role, you can attach some kind of privileged access to a user, but not grant it to them permanently. And you can attach it to them for specific amounts of time or for specific reasons. You can log that. It's very, very useful. And if you haven't looked at it, honestly, I would be surprised. No judgment, of course. Uh, Educate your developers and provide guidelines and patterns. I've seen plenty of instances, especially in IR, where developers just don't know best practices. They haven't been properly educated and they become a vector for attack. You want to ensure that service accounts are non-interactive because service accounts have a lot of power. And last but not least, you're going to want to implement MFA for the password vault and many other things, but we will get to that momentarily. Miguel.
Yes. No spoilers. We'll get to MFA in a couple of slides, but first, I want to go over the asset inventory requirement here. John's got a couple of challenges listed here.
So again, asset inventory, I think everyone's familiar with the challenge. It's how do you collect the data and how do you ensure data quality? And when talking about asset inventory data quality, there's three things that I think about is full, accurate, and complete. So full means that you've identified all the assets, you're not missing any assets. Accurate means that the details, the attributes that you've captured for each of those accurates are actually true, that they're not inaccurate. And then complete means that all of the target fields have been filled out. So, we're all familiar with maybe the owner isn't filled in or whatever, that not all of the target fields have been captured. So you can imagine that, across those three things, there's a lot of room for error. The other Another challenge can just be defining the scope. So, traditional sort of your basic asset inventory is going to be physical hardware, make, model, and serial number. But more the expectation is going to be more around, do you have a list of the operating systems and then mapping those operating systems to the applications that are being hosted. You can continue down the rabbit hole of, do you have an inventory of your database? Do you have an inventory of all of your file shares? What about virtual assets like virtual machines and containers? Where does it really end? I think in one of the federal regulations, they started looking at external connections. Show me your inventory of external connections to vendors and third parties. So the scope of asset inventory can really expand depending on what you're targeting. And then I think another challenge is just establishing that single source of truth, that you've got all of your, once you've established your complete accurate inventory, are all of your processes using the same set of data. So your vulnerability management process, security monitoring, identity and access management, all of that plugging into the same inventory, so that that's harmonious and everyone's working off of the same book. But again, that can be quite a challenge. Miguel, you want to ask us some questions about how we do this?
Right. As a regulator, I'm going to be concerned with how you ensure the accuracy and the completeness of your IT asset inventory, right? One question that comes to mind is, how often do you update this inventory? It's a fairly straightforward question, but can be pretty difficult to answer. You have to think about how do you know that your assets are classified appropriately? How do you make sure that's the case? Mm, how is the life cycle of each of your IT assets managed from procurement to disposal? And then there's the issue of shadow IT. How are you going to detect unauthorized assets on your network? For a requirement that seems as straightforward as asset inventory, I think there's a lot of questions that a regulator can ask. And I think in addressing these to get the ball rolling, I think Richard has a few ideas.
Sure, of course. Thank you, Miguel. I would just, even though it's not in this slide, say that when it comes to addressing shadow assets on your network, in my opinion, the only thing that will do that is manual consultancy, manual intervention by your employees or consultants. Will chase those things down. I've never found a scanner that got everything. But so back to these recommendations as they are on the slide. You heard John speak about a centralized single point of truth. we also need a centralized single point of ownership for that point of truth. It doesn't have to be a person, it could be a group, but there needs to be individuals or a group responsible for this single point of truth. It needs to be able to contain everything. Of course, auto discovery, as we discussed, is important because you don't want to do any more legwork than necessary, and auto discovery will capture the bulk or majority of your devices, of your assets, but not all of them, of course. You have to account for data quality and periodic data review, recertification by asset owners. This again comes back to security not being a straight line, but more of a circle or a treadmill for some of us. Um, and independent data quality review audit. You're going to want to have third-party auditors in most cases to some degree or another to deal with this. IT asset management and or a CMDB solution. Uh, you it happens less in financial institutions, perhaps, but you would not be surprised, or perhaps would be surprised, at the number of institutions that I've consulted with who don't have an asset management solution at all, and whose IT department and department leads have very little idea of what they are running and what's on their network. A great example is a fellow consultant once talked to us about how he was on site doing a pen test and found an AS400 server, and he said, "So what's this thing do?" And they said, "We don't have an AS400. He said, "Well, I'm on it." So last but not least, asset classification scheme is a key to prioritization and risk management. And back to you, Miguel.
Thanks, Richard. So we'll move on to the last of our top five, and that's multi-factor authentication. So one of the reasons I want to give some a little extra background on this, one of the reasons we've included this is because of the strange background of this requirement. In the original version, the DFS prescribed MFA for remote access, third-party apps, and privileged accounts. But during the comment period of the draft regulation, someone, not us, our policy is to remain neutral in regulatory matters, but someone suggested that the MFA requirement was not sufficient and recommended that MFA should be utilized for any individual accessing any system. Uh, NYS DFS agreed and made it so. But what does that mean in practice? Is the expectation that MFA would be required for a user to access the network again and again to access email for each of the app or any other application? So I sent a query to the Department of Financial Services asking if covered entities could satisfy the requirements um, if they implement an MFA at an SSO entry point, right? And then once you're authenticated, users can access federated systems without having to re-authenticate. We're currently waiting on a response so we can better provide guidance on this. MFA is a great security check, but it does add some friction and tends to annoy users. But the question remains, will DFS interpret the requirement as MFA at the perimeter and then free range on the network? We hope so. And stay tuned. But to go over some of the challenges, I'll hand that over to John.
Thanks, Miguel. So yeah, I think the main thing is just the potential ambiguity about this requirement, and it does the final version says MFA is required for any individual accessing any system. So that's likely would allow for SSO and Federation, that they're not really expecting that every single application that you open you need to re-authenticate with MFA, but you never know, and individual regulators may interpret that in different ways. An examiner may look at a particular system and say, oh well, this is a trading system, or this system has sensitive data in it. Why don't you have MFA implemented here? So again, Miguel's followed up. We're hoping to get some more information from DFS on that. Richard, do you want to talk about some of the recommendations?
Yeah, thanks, John. So again, MFA, we're hoping that MFA as a single sign-on for the entry point will be how DFS responds. But in addition, you'll need to assess gaps, develop strategy and roadmap. Um, as John mentioned, you're going to want to assess which systems are incredibly vital or perhaps sensitive. And even if DFS comes back and says that MFA as a single sign-on point is enough, I would still consider it more secure and a better posture to add MFA to those highly sensitive systems. As you see, we've got some reoccurring themes here, such as engaging and educating the application owners. I think that everybody on this call has probably heard that the most likely and greatest point of failure in security in these systems is the human element. So never forget that, of course. We need to communicate and educate users. And for legacy systems, you may want to use jump servers or some other method to secure these legacy systems for use.
Thanks for that, Richard. So that concludes the top 5 challenges. As we've seen today, the NYS DFS Second Amendment is a significant uplift and is going to present some significant challenges and some more stringent requirements as well. We recommend financial institutions perform a readiness assessment against these challenges and on any new requirements proactively to identify gaps before the deadline comes, before NYDFS comes knocking at your door. WithSecure can help through service offerings such as cyber maturity assessments and CISO as a service. Now, before we get to Q&A, we did want to open up a quick poll to everyone. Of the 5 challenges you discussed, which do you see as your number 1? And I will be opening that up on the GoToWebinar shortly. Okay, that poll is in progress. We'll give everyone a minute to answer.
It's always fun to watch the numbers come in real time.
Yep. Okay, it's been 1 minute and 71% of you have voted. So we see here that we've got timely vulnerability remediation and asset inventory tied for what you all think is your number 1 challenge, followed by multi-factor authentication and with privileged access management and BCDR plans and testing tied for last. So I will go ahead and close the poll here. Now, let's go over the Q&A. John, Richard, are you ready?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's see. We've got a couple of questions here related to MFA. And so I think we have Mark and Youssef both asked if MFA means logging into a workstation. And so I think that's more related to the question that we asked the DFS, if having that MFA sort of at a gateway to a organization's network counts as fulfilling that regulation. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think it's ambiguous. So I think the question is around when you connect remotely, you MFA is almost always used or should be used. But what about for a user who comes into the office when they go and log into their workstation at their desk in the office? Is MFA going to be required? We don't know. It would the regulation would seem to imply that, but we're through Miguel's reach out, we're hoping to get more clarity on that. It's a great question, and we just don't know the answer.
Another question from Mark around MFA is, does the DFS defines an information system, but that term is a little ambiguous. Asking for our help with that definition. So I think that's might also fall in line with the question that we asked DFS. Information system is a rather broad term and could apply to almost anything that you would log into, right?
So I think that they've intentionally left certain things broad so that when the auditors come time to interpret those. They have some freedom to interpret them, but I think that ultimately what we will find is that over the course of the next year, there's going to be a more common interpretation that we see the auditors come up with. So even though information systems is incredibly ambiguous, as you mentioned, Mark, in your question, I do think that we will find a bit more of a tightening up on that definition as the DFS figures out what they want it to mean.
Yep, yep, I think so as well. Let's see. Going down the other questions that we have here. Let's see. John, I think you might have some background on this. This is regarding the fines leverage by DFS. This is a question from Chris. You mentioned 11 instances of fines being leveraged. Did you notice any trends identified in those violations? Like what kinds of issues were people most getting dinged for?
Sure. Good question. So the trend is that if a covered entity experiences a security breach, they get a fine. That's what we've seen is anywhere where all of the enforcement actions were as a result of a security breach, except for one. So that's probably the biggest driver. That one outlier was one of the fairly new ones, and it just sort of indicates that in this case, the enforcement action was not related to a breach, but it was related to an exam. And the DFS came in and found that this institution wasn't meeting the requirements. And so that was the first time that they issued a penalty that wasn't specifically related to a breach. In terms of the breaches, nobody will be surprised to know that it's all phishing. So I'd say had to have been at least 3/4 of the breaches that are described in those enforcement actions had to do with phishing. They often concluded that this would have been prevented if the multi-factor authentication had been in place, that the user gave their password, but then the attacker was able to log in and MFA would have prevented that. So that's, I think, the main reason you're seeing the push for more and more MFA, which is obviously is a good suggestion to have in place. There was one interesting incident where the institution did have MFA in place, and the attacker just continually sent, requested the code from the user over and over and over, and finally the user just clicked OK, and they were able to get in. So, I think Richard mentioned when we were talking about MFA, educating your users and making sure if you don't recognize that, MFA sign-in request, don't click OK. So there's that. There were some ransomware attacks. I mean, it was phishing leading to ransomware, which is pretty familiar. And there were probably 3 or 4 that resulted in theft of funds, where the attacker was able to actually steal money based on the breach.
And just to build on John's comment on MFA, that is, I believe, how we came up with the term MFA fatigue, and also why a lot of organizations are moving towards MFA with a 2-digit required number that fails automatically if you don't have that number. So you may be most familiar with Microsoft Authenticator presenting you with a 2-digit number that you have to enter in order to successfully pass the MFA request.
Another question we have here, related to these fines. For the DFS to fine you, they have to know that you're not in compliance. Reba here is asking, their company has configured access reviews for systems under DFS's purview since 2018, but they haven't heard they haven't had any regulators reach out to them about auditing. What kind of approach does the DFS take towards auditing, and maybe how frequently, how do you get selected for an audit?
In terms of how does the DFS determine which institutions they're going to examine, or whether, so
Right, I think
that
that's
piece I don't know what the secret sauce of picking who's going to get examined. I believe that they would base that on the size and complexity of the institution, and then obviously if there's a breach, that they're going to be doing they would do an examination to understand what happened there. But I would imagine that they'll go through the rotation and address each of the covered entities in order, and probably in order of their size and complexity. There's also I believe it's a new requirement for independent audits to be performed. The initial draft of the amendment required that it was an external auditor who performed that annual review, but there was some pushback on that to say, we should be able to rely on our own internal audit department, and they walked that back. So the audit doesn't need to be by a third. The audit of the information security program does not need to be by an external auditor, but that audit department internal audit needs to be independent, and you'll need to provide evidence that those annual reviews occurred.
Right. So there's no way of knowing how the NYDFS is going to select you. There's no advance warning, but it's certainly not something that you want to be unprepared for.
You could be the first person to ever ask them to come visit without, you know, without them having initiated the contact.
We've got another question from Chris here regarding vulnerability management, and that's asking if does the standard differentiate between vulnerability types? For example, code, container vulns, cloud, server.
And that's a good question. No, it does not go into that level of detail, which again becomes a ambiguity and can open up to sort of some creep in the scope. It also doesn't specifically mention, it mentions automated scans, but it doesn't specifically mention the other types of vulnerabilities. Like, for example, source code scans would normally be considered a vulnerability. So if you're doing, static and dynamic scans of your applications, that would be vulnerabilities. Also, I would expect that the results of manual penetration testing would also be considered as a vulnerability. So you would need to be able to demonstrate that if a vulnerability was discovered through a pen test, is that being addressed in a timely manner as well. So again, not a lot of specificity around what exactly is the scope of vulnerability management. So I would expect the examiners could dig into that, and it would be interesting to see where they go.
Yep, thanks for that, John. We had another question come in about fines levied by DFS. So that figure, the average of 3 million, is that per violation or for overall non-compliance?
Well, that's an average across the entire number of violations that were analyzed. So it's not a per violation 3 million, and it's a specific to violations. It's not just for being non-compliant to all of the DFS amendment. John, maybe you want to speak to one of the more interesting finds that you saw when analyzing it?
Yeah, yeah. So like Richard mentioned, that figure is based on the average across enforcement actions, and the enforcement actions talk about violations of specific, which um, um, sections of the regulation were violated. And it's like we mentioned, it's most commonly around access. If it was a phishing attack, that they'll indicate that the user awareness and training was insufficient. Depending on what actually happened, they'll list out in the enforcement action which sections were violated. But it doesn't seem like there's a direct correlation between the number of sections that were found to be non-compliant and the fine. The fines are more based on the size of the organization. And I think in one case, there was a smaller institution that got a smaller fine, 100 or 200,000, and they specifically mentioned that this was based on the size and revenue of the organization. In the amendment, there's also a section that talks about the factors that they will this is new, that talking about the factors that they'll take into account with regard to assessing the penalty. So that's interesting to look at. I don't remember the specifics, but it's around were there other were there previous issues found, were there unresolved vulnerabilities that led to this, and so on and so forth. But they've given some more detail and criteria around how they're going to assess those fines.
All right, and I think we're about 2 minutes over the scheduled time. Let's see. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you, John and Richard. Um, their contact information is provided here. Yeah, thank you all for joining. I hope this session was useful for you.
Thank you.
And feel free to contact us with the emails listed up here.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you everybody for attending. We'll look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.